The cameras flashed like lightning strikes across the marble lobby of Harrington Pharmaceuticals. David's hands trembled as he gripped the podium, his grey hair disheveled, his $3,000 suit wrinkled from a sleepless night. The boardroom had never been this quiet. Reporters leaned forward, their microphones stretched toward him like accusatory fingers. His voice cracked. The man who had commanded respect in every business meeting for 30 years couldn't find his words. Behind him, the corporate logo gleamed cold and metallic. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for. I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. The silence was suffocating. His CFO, Margaret Chen, watched from the corner with horror in her eyes. His PR team frantically texted on their phones, already calculating the damage. The stock ticker on the wall screen showed Harrington Pharmaceuticals plummeting in real time. 3 months ago, I met someone who changed everything I thought I knew about success. His breath caught. Someone who showed me that I've been living my entire life as a coward. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cameras clicked furiously. In the front row, Rebecca Morrison from Seattle Business Journal scribbled notes, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. This wasn't the David Harrington they knew, the ice-cold pharmaceutical mogul who had fired 3,000 employees without blinking, who had raised drug prices during the pandemic, who had turned grief into ruthless ambition. His name is Tommy, David continued, his voice growing stronger, and he's the bravest person I've ever met. But how had it come to this? How had a man worth $900 million, feared and respected throughout the Pacific Northwest, ended up confessing his deepest shame in front of the entire American business world? To understand that, you'd have to go back to where it all began, 3 months earlier, on the rainiest night Seattle had seen in decades. 3 months earlier, the penthouse at the Four Seasons felt more like a mausoleum than a home. David Harrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city lights blur through the December rain. At 58, he had everything a man could want, wealth that most could only dream of, a company that dominated the pharmaceutical industry, properties in Malibu and Manhattan. But the silence in his $8 million home was deafening. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer, the very disease his company claimed to fight. The irony wasn't lost on him. All the treatments money could buy, all the experimental drugs from his own labs, and still she slipped away on a Tuesday morning while he was in a meeting about quarterly projections. His son, Michael, lived in Boston now, a pediatric surgeon who hadn't called in 6 months. Their last conversation had ended with Michael saying, "You turned Mom's death into an excuse to become even more heartless, Dad. At least grief is human. What you've become isn't." The words still cut deep, even now. But what Michael didn't understand was that feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. When Sarah died, David had 2 choices: crumble or build walls so high that nothing could hurt him again. He chose the walls. His assistant, Janet, knocked on the door. "Mr. Harrington, the car is ready for the Children's Hospital benefit." David straightened his black tie and grabbed his coat. These charity events were business, nothing more. Networking opportunities disguised as compassion. He'd write a check for $50,000, pose for photos, and be home by 10 to review the monthly reports. It was all performance, a necessary evil to maintain his reputation. But tonight would be different. Tonight, everything he thought he knew about himself would shatter like glass on concrete. The Seattle Children's Hospital benefit was held at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, downtown's crown jewel. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and was filled with the city's elite. Tech moguls from Amazon and Microsoft, shipping magnates, real estate developers. David moved through the crowd like a shark through water, shaking hands and making small talk about market trends and tax legislation. "David," a familiar voice called out. Jonathan Reed, his longtime business rival, approached with a predatory smile. "Surprised to see you at a children's charity event. Didn't think you cared about kids anymore since Michael moved away." The jab was subtle but sharp. David's jaw tightened. "Just doing my civic duty, Jonathan." "Of course. I heard about your latest price hike on insulin. Very civic of you." David excused himself and moved to the bar. This was why he hated these events. The fake smiles, the veiled insults, the constant performance of caring about causes he'd never truly invested in emotionally. He nursed a scotch and watched the presentation about children's programs, clapping at appropriate moments while his mind wandered to tomorrow's acquisition meeting. But something in the presentation caught his attention. A photo of children with Down syndrome, smiling and playing in a therapeutic garden. The hospital director spoke about inclusion programs, about seeing ability instead of disability. David found himself staring at their faces, so open, so genuinely happy. When was the last time he'd smiled like that? Sarah used to volunteer at a special needs school before she got sick. She'd come home with stories about the kids, how they taught her more about joy than any philosophy book ever could. David had always been too busy to listen, too focused on the next deal, the next acquisition. He regretted that now, another item on a list that seemed to grow longer every year. The event ended with the usual pleasantries. David wrote his check, posed for the obligatory photo with the hospital board, and stepped outside into the December night. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and dark shadows. "Mr. Harrington, your car will be here in just a moment," his driver called through the phone. But as David waited under the hotel's awning, something in the distance caught his eye. Across the street, hunched against a building, was a figure in the rain. Something about the person's posture, defeated, vulnerable, made David look closer. He couldn't have known it then, but that figure would change his life forever. Because sometimes, salvation comes to us not through grand gestures or divine intervention, but through a simple moment of human recognition in the midst of a storm. And that's when David saw him clearly for the first time, a young man with Down syndrome, soaked to the bone, crying alone in the rain. The young man couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a thin jacket that offered no protection against Seattle's December fury. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and his shoulders shook, whether from cold or tears, David couldn't tell. Maybe both. David's first instinct was to look away. This wasn't his problem. His driver would arrive any minute, and he'd be home to his quiet penthouse, away from the mess and complexity of other people's pain. That's how he'd survived the last 3 years, by not getting involved, by not letting the world's suffering penetrate the fortress he'd built around his heart. But something kept him watching. The young man wasn't asking for money or attention. He was just broken, utterly, completely broken in a way that David recognized despite trying to forget. It was how he'd felt the night Sarah died, standing alone in their bedroom, not knowing how to breathe in a world that no longer made sense. "Sir?" a hotel doorman approached. "Is everything all right?" "That man," David pointed across the street. "How long has he been there?" The doorman squinted through the rain. "Oh, that's Tommy. He's been there about an hour. We called the police, but they're busy with accidents from the storm. Poor kid looks lost." Tommy, even his name sounded innocent. David's phone buzzed. His driver. "Pulling up now, Mr. Harrington." This was the moment. Get in the car, go home, pretend he'd never seen anything. It would be easy, it would be safe, it would be exactly what the old David Harrington would do. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "You can't save everyone, David, but you can save someone. That has to count for something." Before he could talk himself out of it, David stepped into the rain. The cold hit him like a slap. His expensive shoes splashed through puddles as he crossed the empty street, his heart pounding with each step. What was he doing? He didn't know anything about helping people with special needs. He was probably making everything worse. "Hey," he called out softly as he approached. "Are you okay?" Tommy looked up, and David saw his face clearly for the first time. Despite the tears and the rain, there was something luminous about his features, an openness that David had forgotten existed in the world. His eyes were dark and kind, framed by thick lashes that were now heavy with raindrops. "I'm lost," Tommy stammered, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence that David recognized from the hospital presentation. "My mom, she's supposed to pick me up, but she's not coming. Where were you supposed to meet her?" "The movie theater. We went to see the Christmas movie, but when it was over, she wasn't there." Tommy's chin trembled. "I waited and waited, but she never came." David felt something crack inside his chest. This young man had been abandoned, left alone in the rain, and still he spoke of his mother with hope rather than anger. When was the last time David had given anyone that kind of unconditional trust? "What's your mom's name? Maybe we can call her." Linda Patterson." "But," Tommy's face crumpled, "she can't come. She's with Jesus now." The words hit David like a physical blow. Tommy's mother was dead, and somehow, in his confusion or grief, he'd gotten lost trying to find her. David knelt down, not caring that the rain was destroying his $3,000 suit. "I'm David," he said gently, "and I'm going to help you get somewhere safe, okay?" Tommy's face brightened slightly. "Like a friend." A friend. When was the last time someone had called David that? When was the last time he deserved to be called that? "Yeah," David said, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. Like a friend. But as David helped Tommy to his feet, he had no idea that this simple act of human decency would soon become the most scrutinized decision of his life. Because in a world where billionaires were expected to be ruthless and people with disabilities were often invisible, the sight of David Harrington, pharmaceutical mogul and certified bastard, helping a young man with Down syndrome would trigger a chain of events that neither of them could possibly anticipate. His driver pulled up just as they reached the sidewalk. "Where to, Mr. Harrington?" David looked at Tommy, who was shivering in the warm car, and realized he had no idea what came next. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt responsible for someone other than himself, and that changed everything. The Sunrise Care Home sat on the outskirts of Seattle like a forgotten afterthought, a tired building with peeling paint and windows that had seen better decades. David's Mercedes looked obscenely out of place in the parking lot, surrounded by beat-up Honda Civics and a van with a missing hubcap. "This is where you live?" David asked, trying to keep the shock out of his voice. Tommy nodded enthusiastically, seemingly oblivious to the building's shabby condition. "Room 7B. I have a roommate named Carlos. He snores, but he shares his cookies." David's throat tightened. This was where society stored people like Tommy, out of sight, out of mind, warehoused with minimal care and maximum efficiency. The same cold calculation that drove his business decisions, applied to human lives. Inside, the lobby smelled of disinfectant and resignation. The night supervisor, a tired woman named Gloria, emerged from behind a desk stacked with paperwork. "Tommy, we've been worried sick. Where have you been?" "I went to the movies to see Mom," Tommy explained with the innocent logic that broke David's heart. "But I got lost in the rain. David helped me." Gloria looked at David with suspicion. A well-dressed stranger was never good news in her experience. "And you are?" "David Harrington. I found him downtown and wanted to make sure he got home safely." Recognition flickered in Gloria's eyes. She'd seen him on the news, read about his company's scandals. Her expression hardened. "Well, thank you for bringing him back, Mr. Harrington. We can handle it from here." But David didn't move. He looked around the lobby, at the water stains on the ceiling, the broken chair in the corner, the vending machine with half its lights burned out. "How many people live here?" 43 residents. "We do our best with what we have." What we have. It was clearly never enough. David had spent more on his last business lunch than this place probably saw in a month. "Tommy," Gloria said gently, "why don't you go get ready for bed? It's past your bedtime." "Okay." Tommy turned to David with that radiant smile. "Thank you for being my friend tonight." "You're welcome," David managed. As Tommy disappeared down the hallway, Gloria's professional mask slipped slightly. "Look, Mr. Harrington, I appreciate what you did tonight, but Tommy gets confused sometimes. His mother died 6 months ago and he still expects her to show up places. We're working on it with his therapist." 6 months. Sarah had been gone 3 years, and David still sometimes caught himself buying her favorite coffee. How much harder must it be for Tommy with his different way of processing the world? What kind of support does he have? Family? Friends? Gloria shrugged. His mum was all he had. She worked 3 jobs to keep him out of the state facility. This place isn't perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. David wanted to ask more questions, but Gloria was clearly done with the conversation. As he walked back to his car, Tommy appeared at a second-floor window, waving goodbye. David waved back and something shifted in his chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. It felt like purpose. The next morning, David couldn't concentrate on his meetings. Every time he looked at financial projections or listened to his executives discuss profit margins, he saw Tommy's face in the rain. The image haunted him through lunch with potential investors, through conference calls about market expansion, through everything that had once felt so important. By afternoon, he'd made a decision that his rational mind knew was foolish. He was going back to the care home. This time, he came prepared. He'd stopped at a downtown men's store and bought a selection of sweaters and jackets in Tommy's size, along with a pair of proper rain boots. It wasn't much, but it was something. The day's supervisor, a younger man named Derek, was more welcoming than Gloria had been. "Tommy talks about you constantly. My friend David this, my friend David that. You made quite an impression. Can I see him?" Derek hesitated. "We have policies about visitors who aren't family or legal guardians." David's wallet appeared before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. Perhaps a donation to the facility would help clarify the situation. The check he wrote was for $10,000, Not enough to change anything fundamental, but enough to get Derek's attention and access to Tommy. They found him in the common room working on a jigsaw puzzle with intense concentration. When he saw David, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "David, you came back. I brought you something." David handed over the shopping bag, feeling strangely nervous. He couldn't remember the last time he'd bought a gift for someone without an ulterior motive. Tommy pulled out a blue sweater and held it up to his chest. "It's beautiful. Look, everyone. David brought me a present." The other residents gathered around, examining the clothes with appreciation. David watched their faces. So much joy over something so simple. When was the last time he'd felt genuine happiness over anything money could buy? "Can I show you my room?" Tommy asked. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and sadness. Tommy's room was small but meticulously neat. 2 single beds, a shared dresser, and a small desk by the window. On the nightstand was a framed photo of Tommy with a middle-aged woman who had his same kind eyes. "That's my mum," Tommy said proudly. "Her name was Linda. She was the best mum in the world." "She looks wonderful," David said, and meant it. "She used to say I was her sunshine even when it was raining." Tommy touched the photo gently. "I miss her." The simple honesty of it broke something loose in David's chest. When was the last time he'd admitted missing someone? When was the last time he'd let himself feel grief without immediately burying it in work or alcohol or anger? "I miss someone too," David found himself saying. "My wife, Sarah." Tommy nodded solemnly. "It's okay to be sad. Mom said sadness means we loved someone very much." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who understood loss in their own ways. Then Tommy brightened. "Do you want to see the garden? Mom planted flowers there before she got sick." Behind the care home was a small courtyard with raised garden beds, most of them brown and neglected in the December cold. But in one corner, a few winter roses still bloomed, their red petals bright against the grey day. "She planted those for me," Tommy said. "She said they'd keep blooming even when everything else looked dead." David stared at the roses, thinking about Sarah's garden at their house in the hills, how he'd hired gardeners to maintain it after she died, but never once walked through it himself. He'd preserved it like a museum exhibit rather than a living memorial. "Tommy," he said quietly, "would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow somewhere nice? Really, like a restaurant?" "Like a restaurant." Tommy's excitement was infectious. "I've never been to a fancy restaurant. Mom always said maybe someday, but..." His voice trailed off. "Well, someday is tomorrow." David had no idea that this simple invitation would soon become front-page news. He didn't know that taking Tommy to dinner at Seattle's most exclusive restaurant would trigger a media storm that would expose every dark corner of his past. He was just a man trying to honor a promise to his dead wife that he'd never actually made, the promise to save someone even if he couldn't save everyone. But in a city where image was everything, and compassion was often viewed with suspicion, David Harrington's sudden interest in a young man with Down syndrome would soon become the story that defined them both. The question was, would it destroy them or save them? The reservations manager at Canlis, Seattle's most prestigious restaurant, hesitated when David made the reservation. "Will this be a business dinner, Mr. Harrington?" "Personal," David replied, a word that felt foreign in his mouth. The next evening, David picked up Tommy in his Mercedes. Tommy had worn his new blue sweater and combed his hair with obvious care. His excitement was barely contained as they drove through downtown Seattle, past the glittering shops and towering buildings. "Is that the Space Needle?" Tommy pressed his face to the window. "It is. Have you ever been up there? Mom always said we'd go someday. She was saving money for the elevator ride. Another someday that would never come." David made a mental note. After dinner, they were going to the Space Needle. Some promises deserved to be kept, even by proxy. Canlis sat perched on a hill overlooking Lake Union, its mid-century architecture and floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the city. It was the kind of place where senators ate with tech moguls, where deals worth millions were negotiated over Wagyu beef and $200 bottles of wine. The maitre d' greeted David with professional warmth. "Mr. Harrington, your table is ready." But as they walked through the dining room, conversations quieted. David felt the weight of curious stares, the subtle phone cameras turning in their direction. Tommy, oblivious to the attention, was mesmerized by the view. "It's like being in the clouds," he whispered. Their server, a young woman named Ashley, approached with barely concealed surprise. She'd clearly expected David's usual type of dinner companion, business associates, or the occasional socialite. not a young man with Down syndrome wearing a J.C. Penney sweater. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington. Can I start you with something to drink?" "I'll have the Macallan 18. And Tommy, what would you like?" Tommy studied the menu with serious concentration. "Do you have chocolate milk?" Ashley glanced at David, unsure how to respond. In Canlis's 30-year history, no one had ever ordered chocolate milk. "I'm sure we can arrange something," David said smoothly. "And bring it in your finest glass." As Tommy explored the menu, asking questions about every dish, delighting in the descriptions, David found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious. He approached the evening with the wonder of a child, but the thoughtfulness of someone who understood that not everyone got chances like this. "David," Tommy said suddenly, "why are you being so nice to me?" The question caught David off guard. Why was he doing this? The rational answer, guilt, loneliness, some misguided attempt to honor Sarah's memory, felt insufficient in the face of Tommy's directness. "Because," David said slowly, "you remind me that there's still good in the world." Tommy smiled. "Mom used to say I was put here to help people remember how to be happy. I didn't understand what she meant, but I think I'm starting to." Across the dining room, David noticed Rebecca Morrison, the business journalist, dining with what looked like a sauce. She kept glancing in their direction, her reporter instincts clearly activated. David had been in the news enough to recognize that look, the calculating gaze of someone who smelled a story. By the time they finished dinner, Tommy had ordered the salmon and declared it better than fish sticks. Word had clearly spread. As they left the restaurant, a photographer was waiting outside. The flash exploded in the December darkness. Tommy flinched and grabbed David's arm. "It's okay," David murmured, but his heart was racing. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of without realizing it. The story broke online before they even reached the Space Needle. Pharmaceutical mogul's mysterious dinner. Date David Harrington spotted at exclusive restaurant with unidentified companion. By morning, the speculation had exploded across social media and business news sites. The photo showed David and Tommy walking out of Canlis together, David in his perfectly tailored coat, Tommy in his thrift store jacket, both of them squinting against the camera flash. The theories ranged from ignorant to cruel. New PR stunt from Big Pharma? Harrington trying to rehabilitate his image after the insulin price scandal? Who is the mystery man, and why was he at Seattle's most expensive restaurant? David's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, board members, and business associates. His PR team was in crisis mode, demanding an explanation, crafting damage control strategies. But the call that hurt most came from Michael in Boston. "Dad, what the hell is going on? There are reporters calling my hospital asking about your secret son or some bullshit. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" "It's not what you think, Michael." "Then what is it? Because from here it looks like you're using some disabled guy as a prop for whatever midlife crisis you're having." The words stung because David heard his own fears reflected in them. Was that what he was doing? Using Tommy to feel better about himself? "I helped someone who needed help, that's all." Right. The great David Harrington, suddenly developing a conscience. Forgive me if I'm skeptical, but the media storm was just beginning. By afternoon, someone had identified Tommy and the Sunrise Care Home. Reporters descended on the facility like vultures, harassing residents and staff, demanding information about Tommy's relationship with David. Gloria called David, her voice tight with anger. "What did you do? We have news vans outside. Tommy is terrified." This is exactly what we were afraid would happen. David drove to the care home immediately, but it was too late. The damage was done. Tommy was hiding in his room, overwhelmed by the chaos, confused by questions he couldn't understand from strangers who didn't care about him as a person. "I don't understand," Tommy said when David found him. "Why are all those people here? Did I do something wrong?" Looking at Tommy's frightened face, David realized he'd made a terrible mistake. In trying to do something good, he'd exposed Tommy to a world that would never see him as anything more than a curiosity or a symbol. The media didn't care about Tommy's humanity. They cared about the story, the angle, the scandal. David had spent 3 years building walls around his heart to protect himself from pain. But he'd forgotten that sometimes those walls don't keep the hurt out. They keep the love in, and when the walls finally crack, everything floods out at once, washing away the careful distance he'd maintained from a world that suddenly felt too complex, too raw, too real to navigate safely. The question now wasn't whether David could protect himself anymore. The question was whether he could protect Tommy from the consequences of his own belated attempt at human decency. And as he looked at Tommy's confused, trusting face, David wasn't sure he knew how to protect anyone at all. The headlines grew worse by the day. Farmer billionaire's charity case, or something more sinister. Inside the disturbing friendship that has Seattle talking, David Harrington's latest acquisition, a disabled young man. The stories painted David as either a calculating manipulator using Tommy for publicity or a lonely billionaire with questionable motives. None of them bothered to ask Tommy what he thought about any of it. To the media, he wasn't a person. He was a prop in someone else's story. David's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The conference room at Harrington Pharmaceuticals had never felt more like a tribunal. Margaret Chen, his CFO, led the charge with barely concealed fury. The stock has dropped 12% in 3 days, David. 12%. Our investors are spooked. Our competitors are circling. And half our clients are asking if you've lost your mind. Jonathan Reed, who served on the board, leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. I have to ask, David, what exactly are you getting out of this relationship? Because from the outside it looks either pathological or pathetic. I'm helping someone who needs help. By taking him to 300 a plate restaurants? By parading him around Seattle's elite establishments? Come on, David. We all know you don't have altruistic bones in your body. What's the angle? The room was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. David looked at the faces around the table, people he'd worked with for years, people who'd helped him build an empire worth billions. And not one of them could conceive of a world where helping someone came without an ulterior motive, because they were right. The old David Harrington didn't do anything without calculating the return on investment. The old David had fired thousands of employees to boost quarterly earnings. The old David had raised the price of life-saving medications because the market could bear it. But something had changed the night he found Tommy in the rain. Something he couldn't quantify or explain in terms they would understand. Maybe, David said quietly, there is no angle. The silence that followed was more damning than any argument. Meanwhile, the harassment of Tommy and the care home residents continued. Reporters posed as volunteers to get inside. Photographers camped outside with telephoto lenses. And social media trolls dissected every photo for evidence of David's supposed agenda. Tommy stopped eating. He stopped working on his jigsaw puzzles. He spent most of his time by his window, watching the news vans with confusion and growing anxiety. I made everyone upset, he told David during one of their now supervised visits. Maybe I should go away so the angry people will leave. You didn't do anything wrong, Tommy. This is my fault. But they keep asking me questions I don't understand. About money and why you like me. I just said you're my friend, but they don't believe me. David's throat tightened. Of course they didn't believe Tommy. In their world, friendship between people like David and Tommy didn't exist without some darker purpose. The possibility that David might simply care about Tommy's well-being, that he might see value in Tommy's happiness for its own sake, was so foreign to their experience that they couldn't accept it. The breaking point came on a grey Thursday morning. David arrived at the care home to find Tommy in the common room, not with his usual puzzle, but holding a piece of paper. What's that? Tommy's face was streaked with tears. A man gave me this. He said you're only pretending to like me because you want to look good on TV. He said rich people don't really care about people like me. David took the paper. It was a printout from a gossip blog, complete with unflattering photos and speculation about David's motives. The headline read, "The Billionaire and the Disabled Boy, Love or Lies." He said, "I'm too stupid to understand that you're using me." Tommy's voice broke. Am I stupid, David? Are you just pretending? Looking at Tommy's tear-stained face, David felt something crack inside his chest, not the careful, controlled crack of grief he'd managed for 3 years, but something deeper and more fundamental. It was the sound of his last defenses crumbling, of 30 years of emotional armor finally failing him completely. "No," he said fiercely, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "You are not stupid. You are one of the smartest people I know because you know something I forgot. How to trust people, how to see good in the world, how to love without conditions or calculations. Then why do they hate me? They don't hate you, Tommy. They hate me, and they're using you to hurt me because that's what people like me deserve." Tommy studied his face with those impossibly kind eyes. People like you? People who spent so long protecting themselves that they forgot how to protect anyone else. That night, David couldn't sleep. He stood in his penthouse looking out at the city lights, trying to figure out how to undo the damage he'd caused. Tommy didn't deserve this scrutiny, this cruelty, this reduction of his humanity to a media spectacle. But as David stared at his reflection in the window, at the face of a man who'd spent 3 decades building an empire on the calculation that most people were expendable, he realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The person he needed to protect Tommy from wasn't the media or the trolls or the reporters. It was himself. The old David Harrington had been right about one thing. He didn't do anything without an angle. Even this. Even his growing love for Tommy, his fierce protectiveness, his desire to give Tommy the life he deserved. It was still about David's needs, David's guilt, David's desperate attempt to prove he wasn't completely hollow inside. Tommy deserved better than being someone's redemption project. He deserved to be loved for who he was, not for what he represented to a lonely billionaire trying to find his way back to his own humanity, which meant David had to make the hardest decision of his life. He had to let Tommy go. But first, he was going to make sure Tommy understood something the world seemed determined to deny, that he mattered, that his life had value, that someone had seen him clearly and loved him completely, even if only for a moment. Even if that someone was too broken to love him the way he deserved to be loved. David's hands trembled as he wrote the letter. 3 drafts lay crumpled in the wastebasket beside his desk, each attempt at explanation falling short of what he needed to say. How do you tell someone you love them by walking away? How do you explain that sometimes protection looks like abandonment? The final version was simple. Tommy, the world is angry at me for reasons that have nothing to do with you. You don't deserve to be part of that anger. I'm going away for a while so the reporters will leave you alone. This doesn't mean our friendship isn't real. It means it's the most real thing I've felt in years, and that's exactly why I have to protect it. You are not stupid. You are not a charity case. You are the bravest, kindest person I have ever known. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Your friend always, David. But when David arrived at Sunrise Care Home the next morning, he found something that changed everything. Tommy wasn't in his room or the common room. He was outside in the garden, kneeling beside his mother's rose bushes in the December cold, carefully wrapping each plant in burlap. "What are you doing?" Tommy looked up, his cheeks red from the cold. "Winter protection. Derek taught me. The roses are strong, but even strong things need help sometimes." The simple wisdom of it hit David like a physical blow. Tommy, sweet, supposedly simple Tommy, was teaching him something profound about survival and care, and the difference between abandoning someone and helping them weather the storm. "Tommy, I came to tell you that you're going away." Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, not angry. "I know. Derek told me about the meeting with the board people. They want you to stop being my friend." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Tommy stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "They think if you stop visiting me, the mean people will stop writing stories. But David, what happens to me when you disappear?" The question hung in the cold air between them. What did happen to Tommy when David disappeared? He'd go back to being invisible, warehoused in a system that saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. The same system David had unknowingly supported through years of charitable donations that were more about tax deductions than human dignity. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." "I don't want to be taken care of. I want to take care of myself. I want to have a job and friends and maybe a girlfriend someday. I want to matter." Tommy's directness stripped away every careful rationalization David had constructed. This wasn't about protecting Tommy from the media storm. This was about David's inability to handle being seen clearly, by reporters, by his board, by his son, by Tommy himself. "The roses don't hide when winter comes," Tommy continued, returning to his work. "They get protected by people who care about them, and they wait for spring. Mom said that's what love is, helping things survive until they can bloom again." David knelt beside Tommy in the dirt, not caring about his $2,000 suit. What if the people who care about them aren't good enough? What if they cause more damage than protection? Tommy looked at him with those impossibly wise eyes. "Mom used to say that broken people can love perfectly, even if they can't love safely. She said the broken part isn't what matters. It's whether you're brave enough to love anyway." Brave enough to love anyway. David thought about Sarah, about how he'd loved her completely until the day she died, and then sealed that love away like radioactive material, too dangerous to touch, too valuable to discard. He thought about Michael, his brilliant son who'd grown up watching his father choose emotional safety over connection. He thought about 30 years of building walls so high that love couldn't get in or out. But looking at Tommy, who'd lost everything and still chose to trust, still chose to hope, still chose to love without guarantees, David realized that safety wasn't the opposite of love. Fear was. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. Board meeting, move to 2, final decision on your position. Come prepared to explain yourself. David stared at the message, then at Tommy carefully tending his mother's roses, and something shifted in his chest. Not the careful crack of controlled grief, but something bigger. The sound of a dam finally giving way after years of holding back floodwaters. Tommy, he said quietly, what would you think if I told everyone the truth about why I care about you? What truth? That you saved me. That night in the rain I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline without even knowing it. That you've taught me more about courage and kindness in 3 months than I learned in 58 years. That loving you, being your friend, it's not charity or PR or guilt. It's the first real thing I've felt since my wife died. Tommy smiled, that radiant expression that had haunted David's dreams and waking hours. I'd think that sounds like something worth telling people, even if it costs me everything. David, Tommy said gently, what if it gives you everything instead? At 2, David walked into the boardroom at Harrington Pharmaceuticals for what he knew would be the last time as CEO. But instead of the prepared resignation speech his advisors had drafted, he had something else in mind. Margaret was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers and board members. Jonathan Reed wore the expression of a man who'd been waiting 30 years for this moment. The atmosphere was funeral quiet. David, Margaret began, we've prepared a statement. I have a statement of my own. David moved to the head of the table, but he didn't sit. Instead, he looked at each face, people who'd helped him build an empire, people who'd enabled his worst instincts and celebrated his cruelest decisions. 3 months ago, I met a young man named Tommy Patterson. He has Down syndrome, and he's the wisest person I've ever known. He taught me something I'd forgotten, that success without love is just expensive emptiness. Uncomfortable shifting around the table, Jonathan rolled his eyes. This company made me rich, but it also made me something I'm not proud of. We've valued profit over people, efficiency over empathy, growth over goodness, and I've led that charge because I thought that's what strength looked like. David, Margaret interrupted, what's your point? My point is that I resign as CEO, effective immediately. Shocked silence. Then the predictable scramble. Discussions of succession plans, stock prices, damage control. But David wasn't finished. I'm also dividing my personal holdings. Half goes to establishing the Linda Patterson Foundation for adults with intellectual disabilities. The other half goes into a trust for comprehensive care and inclusion programs. Jonathan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You're giving away $450 million for some disabled kid you've known for 3 months? I'm investing $450 million in the belief that every human life has value, something this company taught me to forget. David turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Jonathan, the Foundation's first initiative will be providing free insulin to anyone who needs it, indefinitely. The boardroom erupted behind him, but David was already walking away, toward the elevator, toward the lobby, toward a future he couldn't control or calculate or contain, toward Tommy, who was waiting in the garden, teaching roses how to survive winter by wrapping them in love. Epilogue: Spring in Seattle. 6 months later, the Linda Patterson Foundation occupied the top floor of a renovated building in downtown Seattle with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Elliott Bay. Tommy's office was small but bright, decorated with photos from foundation events and a new jigsaw puzzle he worked on during lunch breaks. His business cards read, Tommy Patterson, Director of Community Outreach, a title he'd chosen himself and wore with quiet pride. David's office was across the hall, smaller than his old corporate suite, but infinitely more alive. The walls were covered with pictures from foundation programs, adults with intellectual disabilities working in supported employment, living independently, pursuing dreams the world had told them were impossible. The knock on his door came at 3, their usual time for afternoon coffee. Tommy entered with 2 mugs and that familiar smile that still had the power to rearrange David's entire day. The Seattle Times wants to interview us about the new housing program, Tommy said, settling into the chair across from David's desk. Are you ready for more questions about your transformation? David laughed, a sound that had become easier and more frequent over the past 6 months. What do you think? Should we tell them the truth? Which truth? That you're not really transformed, you're just finally being who you were supposed to be all along. The wisdom in Tommy's observation never ceased to amaze David. Over the months, he'd watched Tommy grow into his role at the foundation with natural leadership and intuitive understanding of what people needed. The world saw Tommy's intellectual disability. David saw his emotional genius. "The housing program is already at capacity," David said, reviewing the latest reports. "We need to expand again." "Good problems to have." Tommy sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Remember when you used to worry about profit margins? Now I worry about people margins, much more complicated." Through the window, David could see the Space Needle gleaming in the afternoon sun. He and Tommy had finally made that elevator ride, not as billionaire and charity case, but as friends who'd learned to see Seattle through each other's eyes. The phone rang. David glanced at the caller ID and felt his heart skip. Michael. His son had started calling monthly after the foundation's launch, their conversations slowly rebuilding the bridge that grief and pride had burned. It wasn't easy. 30 years of emotional distance couldn't be erased with good intentions, but it was honest in a way their relationship had never been. "Hey, Michael. Dad, I have news. Jennifer and we're expecting." David's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Congratulations, that's wonderful. We were wondering, would you like to be involved? Really involved, not just holiday visits and birthday checks. We want our child to know their grandfather." Before David could answer, Tommy had crossed to his desk and was drawing something on a piece of paper. He held it up. A stick figure family with a tiny addition, and the words, "Uncle Tommy," written in careful letters. David smiled, understanding Tommy's hopeful expression. "Michael, I'd love to be involved, and there's someone I'd like you to meet, someone who's taught me a lot about what family really means." After hanging up, David and Tommy sat in comfortable silence, watching the city bustle below. The foundation had changed both their lives, but perhaps more importantly, it had changed the way Seattle thought about inclusion and disability. Other cities were adopting their models. Federal legislation was pending. The ripple effects of one rainy night's decision continued to expand in ways neither of them could have predicted. "David," Tommy said suddenly, "do you ever regret it? Giving up all that money?" David considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he'd been worth $900 million and emotionally bankrupt. Today, he had enough money to live comfortably and a wealth of relationships he'd never thought possible. "You know what I regret? Waiting 58 years to understand the difference between being successful and being significant." Tommy nodded. "Mom used to say that God put us on earth to take care of each other. She said some people figure that out right away, and some people need more time to learn. What about the people who never learn? Mom said they're the ones who need the most love because they're the most afraid." As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, David thought about fear, how it had shaped his life, how it had nearly cost him the best friendship he'd ever known, how it had taken a young man with Down syndrome to teach him that love wasn't something to be feared but something to be practiced, daily and imperfectly and with increasing courage. Outside, Seattle hummed with its usual energy. Tech workers heading home, tourists photographing the waterfront, street musicians filling the air with music. But inside the Linda Patterson Foundation, two friends sat planning ways to make the world a little kinder, a little more inclusive, a little more aware that every human life carries the potential for unexpected grace. Tommy returned to his puzzle, humming softly as he worked. David opened his laptop to review applications for the next round of supported housing. Neither of them spoke of transformation or redemption or the dramatic reversal of fortune that had brought them together. They didn't need to. Some changes are so fundamental they don't require commentary. They simply become the new rhythm of daily life, the quiet background music of two people who found each other in a storm and learned to build something beautiful from the debris of old assumptions. In the end, that rainy December night had given them both exactly what they needed. David found his heart, and Tommy found someone who saw him clearly and loved him completely, not in spite of who he was, but because of who he was. And in a world that too often measures worth by productivity and value by convenience, that was perhaps the most revolutionary transformation of all. The rain had stopped falling in Seattle, but the roses Tommy's mother planted kept blooming, protected, tended, and loved by people who understood that some beautiful things need extra care to reach their full potential. In a world obsessed with success, they finally understood that the greatest achievement is simply to love without shame, to see without judgment, and to build bridges where others see only walls.